and it is an honor and privilege to be part of the Photo Voice. It started last year with Julio as our instructor, and at first, because I am not a photographer, Annabelle is, but then it gave me a chance to realize that photographs are not only photos, but there's a story behind all the photos that we take. And if you have seen the photos outside, we share about story about our life here in Singapore, how we do our work, and the family that we serve also, and the community that goes along with us as well. And I'm so happy, and I would like to thank you, Julio, for bearing with us, and waiting for us every Sunday to be part of this Photo Voice. Thank you.
Good evening to everyone. I'm Annabelle Tagle. I'd like to thank Julio and Dominique and Home, of course, for giving me a chance to use my, not a talent, but a hobby. But Sister Bridget is the one who told me that I should do it, so she told me to use it and do it, to share it to my friends. And I do volunteer as a photographer of home. And of course, I also thank you, my employers, for supporting me for this. Is there thanks to all my friends. Thank you, Julio. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle and Gilda. Okay, so before we start the question and answer section, I would like to invite our esteemed panel to join us on stage. We have with us today Jolwan Wem, Executive Director of the Humanitarian Organization for Migration Economics. We also have with us Celine Demine, a legal consultant for Home as well. On the panel today, we also have Professor Mohan J. Dara, Head of Communications and New Media Department and Director of CARE. And last, but most importantly, we have with us Juvi Lavarius, an advisory board member for the Respect Our Rights campaign and ex-domestic worker in Singapore, who played a lead role in our campaign. So before we start the panel session, can we have each of the panelists introduce themselves, their work, and experience in the field regarding the nature of domestic work in Singapore? Jolwan, maybe we can start with you.
Hello, very loud. Hello, good evening everyone. Thank you for spending time with us. I'm very grateful to the NUS CARE team led by Professor Mohan for initiating this campaign and for working with us, and especially working so closely with the domestic workers, because I think that's where the real change happens, when the campaigns and the project mirrors very closely their voices and their demands. So I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to work with the NUS CARE team. For myself, I've been involved in migrant rights work, and especially with domestic workers for the past 10 years. So I think over these past 10 years, we have seen some changes happen in the social landscape, especially with regard to attitudes towards domestic workers. I mean, clearly there's still a lot of discrimination, exploitation, and abuse going on, as you've seen in the documentary. Yeah, but I think in the years that I've been involved in this home and other organizations who are involved in this work, we've done quite a fair bit of work to raise the profile of this issue so that domestic workers' voices are not marginalized. We still have a long way to go because domestic workers are still excluded from labor legislation. They are excluded from the Employment Act. So this means all the rights that we take for granted as regular employees are denied to them. Yeah. So, for example, the right to sick leave, annual leave, overtime pay, yeah, all the wage workers are entitled to that, but it's excluded from domestic workers. So this is a fight, a struggle, which we continue to fight for, because for us, domestic workers have to be recognized as workers. And in order for that to happen, they need to have equal rights as with all other employees. But we're still quite a long way to go from that. There's still a lot of problems, as you've seen in the documentary. The only thing that we've managed to, I think, win is the weekly day off for domestic workers. And this was legislated 2 years ago. But even so, that legislation has a lot of problems. Yeah, we hear from domestic workers that their day off is only from 10 in the morning to 4 in the evening. So there's no law that says how long their day off should be. And any domestic worker that tries to assert their right to a weekly day off run the risk of being dismissed and repatriated. Yeah, so there's clearly still a lot of things that need to be done. And how Home responds to this is we take a very comprehensive approach. Not only do we provide welfare services like our shelters, our counseling, and our help desks, but we also get involved in public awareness, campaigning. We meet with the authorities regularly to express our concerns. In fact, this morning, Celine and I were just at the Manpower Ministry to talk about some of the trafficking cases that we have seen and communicating our concerns to them, what's happening on the ground, because we believe that by doing direct services, by hearing the voices of the workers, journeying with them through the claims process, we have an in-depth understanding of their experiences and what are the obstacles that they face. So this allows us to give to feedback very substantially, yeah, to policymakers and authorities about what needs to be done in order for this situation, the difficulties to be addressed at a systemic level. So, and what Home is also doing is we realize that, of course, these problems do not just exist in Singapore, because a lot of the abuse and exploitation also happens in countries of origin. And for the women, when they go back to their countries, there's a lot of follow-up work that needs to be done. And we've never really had the resources to do that the past 10 years, but recently we have started to work more with organizations in the Philippines, in Indonesia, to assist these women when they go back to file claims, to file complaints, and also to look into their mental well-being. So yes, it's really a problem that isn't just contained in Singapore. If we truly want to be comprehensive about how we deal with migrant labor exploitation, it requires partnership, not just within the local community, but also with foreign governments, local governments, and NGOs and community partners from around the region. So this is what we are trying to do in order to have a more comprehensive approach to the problem. So I think my 3 minutes is up. Yes.
Julie, maybe you want to...
Hello, good evening everyone. I'm Juvie from Pangasinan, Philippines. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me here. I came here last 2010 to work as a domestic worker because I want to help my family back home, especially my mother and father, who are taking care of my son. I had borrowed money from a loan shark to finance my papers and pay almost $500 to my agent in the Philippines. I had 3 employers. In my first employer, I didn't receive any pay for 7 months because of salary deduction for the agent here in Singapore. They only give me allowance of $10 a month, and I didn't have any day off. The 3 times in those 2 years that I was allowed to go out, I was only given 3 hours. So I always rush all the time to go back home. I worked for my second employer for 17 months and only got paid $20. During the first 8 months, so I was illegally deployed to work in the restaurant. And then at the same time, I'm working at home also. So I always tired. So I asked to change my employers. There was another salary reduction for 3 months when I transferred to my third employer. My mother did not want me to hold onto any of my money. So whenever I go for a day off, she would scan all my things, my pockets, everything, to make sure I don't have anything else except the money she will give me. So my salary was supposed to $550, but she only give me $200. And don't let me send money for my family. So what for that I'm working here? Right? So when I come home, she scans again, all over again, takes any money that I have left on my pocket. She said, this is so it won't be accused of stealing. So on my 6th month, I needed to renew my passport. She wanted me to pay $450 for it. But of course, I asked. The embassy told me it's only $102. So it's a big difference from $450, right? So I couldn't take it anymore for that. Because $450 for us here as a domestic worker is very big money. Comparing in 102. So we can do it in ourselves, right? So I need the money yet. The rest of my salary still was being kept from me. I did not have a single centavo on me. So I decided to run away. I moved the shelter run by Home last April 2014 and asked for help to collect my salary. It was a very painful for me of waiting for 9 months. As my last employer told me that she will do everything for me to remain stuck here in Singapore. She filed so many cases, all of which has been dismissed. But I was the home shelter. Of course, I don't want to, to be affected. So I tried my best not to let my situation bring me down. Yeah, so I make myself busy. I make myself, I participated in many activities such as sewing, baking, singing also, and computer classes. That is a very important also. Computer classes. I learned a lot. I learned so many things. So even I stay for 9 months, I don't have a work, but I make it very special for me. I learned so much from home and care. So I also volunteered to help out at the shelter and at the home office. So through home, I became one of the pioneers of Photo Voice project by NUS Care. I feel that because of all this, I become more confident and felt that I can do more and also be help to others like me. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. My name is Celine and I'm working with Home as a legal consultant. I wanted to thank you all for coming tonight and thank you especially NUS Care and all the domestic workers who have been working on this project and who have put a lot of energy in this great work. I was just saying with Juvie, like, it seems like time is flying. I remember the first meeting we had in Waterloo Street when this project started, and so now a few months have passed and so much has been done. About myself, I'm a migrant worker myself, as you might have guessed with my accent. I'm from Belgium and I'm working with Home on different legal projects. All these projects are related to access to justice and empowerment of migrant workers. In terms of access to justice, there are many barriers for access to justice for migrant workers. So a few of the projects that we are conducting are done in collaboration with Singapore pro bono lawyers. We are grateful to have lawyers who want to put pro bono hours to work for migrant worker community. We have set up a legal clinic where migrant workers can come in and get legal advice on their case. And we get pro bono lawyer also to represent migrant workers in court. The idea is really to bring more cases to court and also bring systematic changes in the implementation of the laws. You have heard, for example, about cases of domestic workers who have been physically abused and who are going home penniless. Actually, if domestic workers want to file civil claims to get monetary compensation, they need a pro bono lawyer to represent them. And we want to bring these kind of cases to court and get, for example, monetary compensation for them. As Jonathan mentioned, migrant workers are obviously crossing border and we don't want access to justice to finish when they are going home. So we have started this collaboration with NGO and lawyers in countries of origin. We want them either to be able to file complaint and to have access to remedies in their countries. Would it be against the employment agent or third parties? And we want them as well, if they return to the country but still want to continue civil claim here in Singapore, we want them to be able to do so. And we need for this collaboration with our partner in receiving and sending country. We are also bringing the voice of migrant workers in our advocacy work. We hear many stories and we want these stories to be heard at the national level but also at an international level. We are working, for example, with submission to some of the UN committee as a grassroots organization. We want the stories of migrant workers in Singapore to be heard at this international level. Another aspect maybe of the work is also empowerment of migrant workers, and we have set up this interesting project with NUS law students who are studying nearby. It's a project called Law and You, where actually law students have set up workshops for domestic workers on their rights and responsibility here in Singapore. I see some of faces of our domestic workers who have already attended this workshop. We are also working on the topic which is trafficking in person. You've heard a lot about trafficking in person in the documentary. And I'm happy to report that since the release of this documentary, a new step has been taken with the Prevention of Human Trafficking Act, which has been published and will be coming to force in March 2015. It's a first step. We've been campaigning for some change in this act, change like more rights for victims of human trafficking, and we will continue to do so in the future. Thank you.
I want to take a moment to thank you for coming to this event and for your support. I want to begin by thanking our NGO partners, Home, in this case, who have been tremendous and amazing in supporting us in doing this work. We wouldn't be here doing this had it not been for Home. And I think a lot of the changes that you see is because of NGOs like Home. We also have our partners, HealthServe, back there, who put a lot on line and a lot at stake to actually be doing this work that is bold and courageous and hopefully makes a difference in creating a space. So I want to talk about care a little bit and about the culture-centered approach, and then use that as a basis to talk about the domestic workers and what we have been observing with voices of domestic workers. And you already heard Juvi's voice sort of articulating some of these points. So the culture-centered approach makes a pretty simple argument that we as academics often take stories from marginalized people and turn them into academic papers to sell them to benefit our own causes without really giving back to the communities that we take from. So the culture-centered approach really begins from that commitment that the stories that you take have an ethic of making a difference in the lives of the people in whom or with whom you participate in creating these stories. So the idea behind the culture-centered approach in some ways is pretty simple. You often see experts reporting surveys or through qualitative analysis, reporting studies. Those often then become the voices of experts who sit behind those journals and articulate their views. So you might have panels, for instance, like this at places like NUS, where you will see a bunch of academics sitting around and pontificating about the condition of domestic workers. So the CCA says that, well, let's invert the table by first putting the people that we are talking about at the table. So it's a communicative idea, right? That by putting the people that you're talking about at the table, you disrupt this silence that we ourselves participate in carrying out. So the idea there is that by giving Juvi a space to articulate her views and to create a space within an academic setting, you disrupt this notion of elite academic theorizing, academic research in the ivory tower. Change then comes from that very standpoint. So this project began about 2 years ago, really, working with domestic workers, trying to listen to their voices. And what happens is we put together an advisory board of foreign domestic workers who start documenting and talking about their stories. Then they come up with a series of problems that they identify as problems they want to work on, and then the solutions they want to create. So the key thing in the documentary that you observed is that the storyline of the documentary, the narratives and the images come from the articulations of the domestic workers. So we are not experts sitting there telling them this is what it's going to be and this is how things are going to be done, but rather they are in charge of the storytelling process and of the narrative. And we argue that that is fundamental to communicative inversion, or inverting the inequality of communication. Because in many ways, the plight of domestic workers, and when you listen to Juvi's story, the common thread in this plight is communicative inequality. And domestic workers talk about this as not having that dignity to articulate what they feel are their rights, not having the space to share their stories, to talk about their stories. So consistent through the themes throughout these last year of our project has been this idea of the dignity of domestic work. This notion that when you go into work, you expect to be respected. You should do the same for us. You should give us the basic dignity that is tied to our work. Another idea, and this kind of got highlighted in both what Jolovan articulated as well as what Celine articulated, is this idea of access to communicative spaces. So the spaces of communication and justice are unequal. So when you think about access to law and legal processes, such as access to civil claims in legal contexts, the space and the context of access to that space is unequal, such that there are actually differences in terms of what juvie can or cannot do. The question then becomes, can she file a lawsuit against her employer who's been accusing her 3, 4, 5 times, one after another, of different kinds of complaints about theft? And then the question becomes, what are the communicative inequalities that are built into that kind of inaccess? The final point I want to sort of wrap up with is that, as you watched in the documentary, there were multiple themes of inaccess to food, sexual abuse, physical abuse, not being given the time to read their contract, being promised a certain amount in the salary, but being given a salary that was dramatically lower than what was promised. In all of these, what Juvie and her friends came up with was the idea that all of these is bound together by this idea of the lack of dignity of domestic workers. So a consistent theme that they kept articulating is, if you want to change this space, start by getting people to give us a dignity and to respect us for the rights that we have as workers. So in that sense, when we started the campaign, the idea behind the campaign was very simple, that you talk back to the structures that have erased you. So the target audience, in a campaign, you typically talk about who is the target audience of your campaign. For them, the target audience was everyday Singaporeans and expats that hire domestic workers, and they had a message for them. And the message was that if you're hiring a domestic worker, you need to treat them just as with the rights of workers, as you would like yourself to be treated as a worker. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very informative discussion and introduction. I think we will start with the question and answer session from the floor. If you could introduce yourself before you ask the question, that will be helpful. Maybe we could start off the first question from somebody from the floor. If not, I will ask the first question.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Leong from Sociology Department. Thank you for coming here and all the interesting presentation. I think I always have a peculiar question about every time we have a panel on this, the audience here, they are already a selected group. You're preaching to the converted, the choir. So the big question bothers me is that how do you outreach to a wider audience, and how do we get them to understand these kind of issues, so then their voices get heard? So we're still confined within the academic environment, so we're limited by that.
Do you want to add? Do you want to go first? Oh, anything.
Is there a particular panelist that you're directing the question to?
Professor.
I was trying to get you to answer that question. I think you raise a great point, and there's of course the limit in terms of whom you're reaching out to. So there are two parts to this campaign which we think are interesting. One is that we ran a series of advertisements on StarHub television. So the campaign was national in scope. We also were able to reach out through print ads in, say, a space like Straits Times, as well as through social media. Now, we did run an initial set of analyses with the data that we gathered. So we gathered national level data in terms of the evaluation of the campaign. So we observe a couple of things. One is that exposure to the messages do seem to change attitudes somewhat. The change is small, but surely there is change in attitudes in terms of what you think about rights of domestic workers. Having said that, I think the struggle continues in terms of really making sure that you're reaching out to the people that need reaching out to. That's one part. The other part is really reaching out to policymakers, because it really seems that you take the day off, the notion of day off, that the policy is in place. But it is really in the implementation of the policy that there are lots of gaps. So that's one question perhaps Celine and Joloman could address, is how do you then go about reaching particular stakeholders and ensuring that the policy is being implemented?
Outreach is something which I think home feels is very important if we want to get this kind of change. So we try as much as possible, of course, not to just preach to the converted. So one of the things that we do is we work quite closely with mainstream and social media to communicate our messages. And we try as much as we can also to talk to schools. Yeah, the schools will let us in. And I think one way in which we can try to reach to a wider audience beyond this is if there are any lecturers or professors here, we could come into your classes to talk to your students, because not all students would be interested to come for an event like that. Yeah, so if you could kind of like allow us to penetrate your class and spread our propaganda, we'd be very happy to do that. Yeah, so this is really an open invitation. Yeah, so if you'd like to bring us in, we'd be very happy to talk, and I'd be very happy to bring in, the migrant worker volunteers. We have quite a number of them here in the audience, the domestic workers, and also the other foreign workers that we help, so they can present together with us. Then you can actually hear their voices and understand their experiences.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Bubbles. I'm also from the Department of Sociology. I'm just very interested what kind of reflexive practices or strategies that you employ whereby the migrant collaborators, as you call them, can depart from the feeling of victimization. And I think the question is related to whose voice is it? Is it the voice for or the voice of the migrants? I think this is a perennial issue that all migrant organizations encounter and face. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for sharing your work with us, and it's very enlightening, especially for our students here. Yeah, sociology and migration, and it's a very
Thank you for that great question. So, share perhaps 3 tools that we use. We talk about tools of dialogue, tools of listening, and tools of reflexivity and journaling. So, the way we start the process in the very beginning is to simply begin by sharing stories. And, domestic workers sit together in an advisory board and talk about the stories and their lived experiences and begin pretty open-ended with the kinds of questions they would like to see asked. From that point then, they become almost like our professors and we become their research team. So they design a certain set of research questions as well as questions that they would like to see answered. We go out then and try to find ways of gathering those through in-depth interviews, focus groups, or surveys. For instance, I'll give you an example. In the very beginning in the stories, they kept talking about this idea that contracts, most of them did not have a chance to even read their contract. So then, that became an interesting point in a sense that we wanted to know, or they wanted to know, how many domestic workers experience this, that they actually don't have a chance to read the contract. So they commissioned a survey that we then began in terms of trying to really figure out how many domestic workers have a chance to read the contract and understand it. So that's one part of the process, beginning the research process that way. As they are doing this, they start writing stories and sharing. But it not only takes textual form in terms of writing, but they also work with Julio on photo voice in starting to take images. So these various modes of communication and expression, they participate in and they bring these together again to talk about in a group and brainstorm. So this took us almost about a year to sort of brainstorm on and think through what are the kinds of problems they want to work on. And it began by a certain set of problems that would change. So it was a pretty dynamic process in that sense. Once they zero in on what they want to work on and what kinds of solutions they want to create, then we talk about things like, I'll give you an example. So in coming up with a documentary, or they said that, okay, so even the mode of communication, that they want to use advertisements or they want to use print ads, they come up with the idea what they want, right? So at that point, then we bring in our expertise in terms of, okay, what does it take to put together a print ad? So what are the nuts and bolts? We share it with them, and then they go through a series of reflective exercises in putting together print ads. And then they vote on which ones they like and how they want to go about it. Then our research team and production team comes in, executes it, brings it back to them, and then they select. So the idea behind this is, you try to build reflexivity within throughout the process. But also part of this, you see, is also our reflexivity. How much role, because this is not just tabula rasa domestic workers without us, right? We are involved in this process. So we also journal in terms of what experiences we are going through and how we are negotiating that and share it with them. So this process of going back and forth is what we really do. But of course, recognizing in all of this, there are tremendous power inequalities. At the end of the day, we are researchers. Home is our NGO partner, and then you have domestic workers, and there are power inequalities there as well. Juvie, did you want to add anything about that process from your viewpoint?
Yeah. Because the processing of everything before you go abroad, like the papers and all that. So you need to search everything if what is the right term and then right way also. Because if you go in the wrong way, like what happened to me, I never research, and so I want to go abroad only. So I just only grab it, whatever it takes. So I just only accept it. So my advice for the domestic worker is need to do something that they never bully you for applying abroad. And then read properly. If you sign something, you must understand. And then read, because the agent they never let you read properly. They just only ask you sign this, sign here, only a seconds, or you just only sign here like that. So what is the time that you can understand what is inside, right? Yeah, so must understand and must read first before sign anything. And that's all.
Hello, yeah. Yes, my name is Liberty Chi. I'm from the Political Science Department. This question, I guess I want to address the concept or the question of access to justice. So it's a really interesting term that I picked up from the documentary and from the speakers. So I guess this question is for Juvie and for Celine and Jolivan. I guess for Juvie first, when you went back home to the Philippines, did you approach the POEA or the NLRC about your case? And if you did, what happened? And for Celine and Jolivan, my understanding is that the only recourse to justice would be if a case were to be filed to the MOM. Is there any other way aside from that? Because it seems that, it was mentioned in the documentary that sometimes it can take us almost 2 years. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I went to PUA and OWA last time before I come here. So I didn't expect also that they still can do the illegal things. I went also to the PIDOS and everything. So the 7 months that they deduct from me, so I'm expecting that all that is correct. Because I only want the time to go abroad, to earn money. Actually, I finished my contract by 2 years, so I didn't go back home that time. In my second, they still took from me is 8 months. So I just only work here for the agent. So even you went to PUA and all that, yeah, it's not really sure. So you must search, you must ask, you must know everything.
Yes, so in terms of avenue for redress, you seem to be familiar with the Filipino context, so obviously it's something, an area where we are developing partnership for all the Filipino domestic workers who sign a first contract in the Philippines. And I mean, in terms of numbers, it's like thousands of Filipino domestic workers who come to Singapore and first sign a contract in the Philippines with their prospective employer in Singapore. And under the Filipino regulation, they have a template contract which state a minimum salary of $400 which is 500 Sing dollar. They have 8 hours mandatory rest. They have 1 mandatory day off a week, and also an important regulation related to placement fees. So under Filipino regulation, Filipino domestic worker cannot be asked to pay placement fee for employment agent. And the majority, if not all of the domestic workers who have signed this contract when they arrived in Singapore are asked to sign a new contract. And under this new contract, their salary might be less than 500 Sing dollar. And for almost all of them, they will have to pay placement fees, meaning that during the 6, 7, 8 months of employment, they will not receive any salary, just an allowance of 10 or 20 Sing dollar. And the money is actually used to repay placement fee to the employment agent. So this is something that has been happening for years, and we have been complaining to MOM and not helping domestic workers when they are back to the Philippines to file a complaint with the POA and with the Philippines authorities. And we have also been helping domestic workers to file complaints here at the Philippines embassy. So that's some of the avenue we are using. But in terms of redress, you were asking like what kind of redress are accessible. It really depends on the complaint, on the type of complaint. They can either file a claim to MOM or to the police, or they can also think about filing a civil case. So it really depends on the nature of the complaint. And in terms of process and the times it takes to resolve some claims, I think in the documentary we've heard about domestic workers who have been physically abused, and typically in our experience, when a domestic worker files a police report for physical abuse, investigation by the police will take about 9 months to a year, and then if the case is brought to court, also the process in court might take a year to 2 years. And during this time, domestic workers stay at a shelter. Some of them have the right to work, but they only have the right to work as a domestic worker. And for many of them who have faced physical abuse, the prospect of going back to a private house and working for a private employer is sometimes very difficult. So that's where comes our advocacy work, where we meet regularly stakeholders. For this physical abuse case, we have had several meetings with the police, with AGC, in order to address our concern and ask for to look into this case to be expedited. And also, some of the case might not know, we might be in the future process under the Prevention of Human Trafficking Act, and that's something we will be looking into it for sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in relation to access to justice. I think one of the main problems, as I see it, is that the system always assumes there's a equal balance of power, and that's never the case. Yeah, whether it's in Singapore or in the Philippines or in Indonesia. In Singapore, for example, in the domestic worker files a complaint, and then a mediation is arranged, and the officer in charge of the case often takes on the so-called neutral approach. Yeah, but not acknowledging that the employer may have more power, more knowledge, more resources to be able to get things going his or her way. Yeah, whereas the domestic worker is unable to do so. When I went to the Philippines, sometime early last year, I assisted a domestic worker to file a complaint at POEA. So I was quite fortunate to have been able to go into the mediation room, yeah, to see how the mediation was conducted. And again, the officer in the POEA office takes on a very neutral kind of approach. Yeah, and then the employment agency that was the other party had a lawyer with him. Yeah, the domestic worker didn't. Yeah, so of course, in such a situation, the domestic worker is disadvantaged and would be willing and would have sometimes feel that she has no choice but to accept a lower amount. Yeah, so I think this is one of the key issues. Even though governments like to say, "Oh, we have mechanisms in place to ensure that justice is done," yeah, but the balance of power often is tilted very much in favor of the employer or the agent, simply because they have more resources and are able to articulate their concerns better than the worker. Yeah.
Thank you. Could we have the next question, please?
Hello. Hi, my name is Gusharan. I'm actually a law student, so my question will naturally progress from the earlier question. You mentioned earlier that you have some interactions with MOM, you regularly interact with them with regards to the various legal issues and some of the civil claims, etc. I'd just like to flip this around, and I'm just wondering, you mentioned as well that many of them sign contracts in the Philippines, and when they come to Singapore, they're contracts that are substantially different terms. I'm just wondering, is there any scope, based on your interaction with MOM, to legislatively mandate that the foreign domestic workers who come here are educated on the terms of their contract? Because many times the civil claims that arise come about after the incident, the events have occurred. That's a very post-ante action. Are you looking at more preventive avenues? For instance, finding ways in which the maids can receive some basic legal education on what their rights are. And do you see any space for that?
Yes, in terms of contract substitution, I don't think we will be seeing any legislative change soon. This is seen as a private matter, and for now, this is seen as a private matter, and no change are going to be addressed. As we see it, the only way to address this issue should be to have a bilateral agreement between the Singapore government and the Philippines government, but this is something we are still asking for. In terms of education, you are right. Actually, that's something we are working on. It's empowerment of migrant workers themselves, and for them to know their rights and stand up for their rights. And we have set up this legal workshop for domestic work on their rights and responsibility in Singapore. And I think, through education, you can bring change. But as Jolovan mentioned, I think that you need to take into consideration the difference between the balance and and the power that the employer and employee have. Because actually, let's take the scenario where a domestic worker wants to assert a right when she arrived here in Singapore and say, you know, I'm not going to sign this contract. I have signed a contract in Philippines, and I want, you know, don't want to sign this new contract. Then the employer can just say, well, if you're not happy with this, I cancel your work permit and I send you back home within a few hours. So it's not only about empowerment, it's also about legislative change, I guess.
I just only want to share about PIDOS that before 2010. So PIDOS is just, they orient us before we go in here in Singapore. So all about culture or what we gonna do if the employer have the culture that something different from Philippines. So we need to know, and then we need to practice also. Yeah.
So so this PDOS, which Julie has shared, it's the pre-departure orientation seminar. So there's actually scope, for domestic workers to know what they're coming into. But the problem with this pre-departure orientation seminar, which the government of the Philippines has instituted, is that it doesn't really reflect what's happening here. So one of the things that we've been telling them is that you need to work with the NGOs in the sending country so that to help you develop the curriculum so that they actually get real, actual, accurate information. Because I think at the moment the seminar is a one-size-fits-all approach. So if you're going to the Middle East, you're going to Korea, you're going to the US, or whatever, so everyone seems to go through the same program. So we don't think that is useful at all. And also, in order for the workers here to have access to justice based on what the countries of origin have legislated for them, the Singapore government must actually acknowledge it and be willing to enforce it. But that's the problem at the moment, because the contracts that they sign in the Philippines is mandated by their government, but the Singapore government here doesn't recognize it. So then when they come here, it gets substituted. And the Singapore government says there's nothing wrong with that because our laws allow that to happen. So we don't have an MOU with the Philippines, for instance, to ensure that the contracts over there can be enforced, will be respected here and will not be substituted. So the same for Burmese domestic workers, for example. There is actually a ban. The Burmese government has actually banned domestic workers from coming to Singapore, but Singapore doesn't acknowledge this ban. So they continue to issue work permits for Burmese domestic workers coming in. So we really need to have intergovernmental cooperation if we want to tackle these issues effectively. But at a bilateral and a multilateral level, this isn't happening. So like Celine mentioned, when they come here, they don't really have the opportunity to say, no, I don't want to sign this contract. Because if you don't sign it, then you go back. And the law allows that. So they don't have a right to seek redress for dismissals which are unfair or wrong. So the structural changes, the legislation, the policy has to facilitate the empowerment. Because they can only be empowered if they are working and living in an environment that allows that to happen. But unfortunately, structurally, these policies and practices are not in place. So domestic workers often find it very difficult to resist because they are hemmed in by all these unhelpful structures.
Thank you, Choloman. We have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, my name is Sabrina. I'm from the Global Studies Department at NUS. And I'd really like to thank NUS Care and Home for the documentary. It really exposed the issues of exploitation faced by foreign domestic workers here. And a few of the takeaways I felt, especially the part in the documentary where the foreign domestic worker was talking about when guests come home and she's locked up or hidden. And it really makes you feel disempowered about where this exploitation is happening in a private space. And I feel like as a student and particularly interested, we come for these events and we find out more about these issues but what role do we play as youth, and where we have more of a, we don't have such an influence on, say, policy or intergovernmental negotiation, but rather on the ground. So what role do you think like university students and youth play in this issue of exploitation?
That's a very good question, actually.
I think you have a big role to play, and the fact that you are here is part of a big role to play. That in everyday context, you go back home or you have friends who hire domestic workers. Part of that is changing attitudes, beliefs. What you fundamentally believe is the position of a domestic worker in your life world. And I think as advocates and as the youth, you have a great role to play in changing that. But I also think that as youth, you have a great role to play in changing policy and changing structures and in informing these structures and making sure that structures are accountable to creating a just and a fair space, you know. So I want to sort of tie back to the earlier point a little bit to give you an example. You know, in the documentary, you saw that in many instances, domestic workers, when they come in, they don't even get to read their contracts. Right? So boom, 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 you go through the pages, you're signed, so you go to the education question. I mean, that very point of implementation, you don't have any rights, basically. You're signing off on something and you're being forced to sign off on something, right? So as the youth, now that you're aware and you have this piece of information, you have an ethic to make change. So the question is going to be, what is that entry point for that change? Are you going to do a Facebook campaign, a Twitter campaign, talk to people? You have many avenues today to make that change.
We probably can have just one more right after this question.
Hi, my name is Hui, and I'm from the US, and I'm from the sociology department. Oh no, I'm from sociology. And sorry, I've got a question. Are there any outreach programs whereby NGOs actually collaborate with maid agencies? Because maid agencies are actually the mediators between employers and employees. And more often than not, maid agencies are very unwilling to help their maids when it's actually their part of their responsibility to do so. Thank you.
Yes, I think agencies actually play such a crucial role because many employers depend on them for advice. Yeah, so agencies are the ones that actually shape behavior of employers and also shape and help to facilitate the employment relationship between the worker and the employer. So I mean, we have seen employment agencies like there's this employment agency called Great Link. Yeah, I'm very happy to spread the bad news about them. Yeah, because they do things like, you know, write a list of don'ts, yeah, for domestic workers and say you cannot have a boyfriend, you shouldn't pray so many times a day, you shouldn't answer back to your employers. So you have agencies that, you know, that actually give such bad advice, and they will tell domestic workers that they shouldn't. They'll tell employers that domestic workers shouldn't have a day off during the first 6 months because if she still has to pay off the loan, and if she goes out, she might get all kinds of funny ideas. Or she might run away. She might get a boyfriend. She get pregnant and all that kind of thing. So the agencies will often give this kind of advice to the employers, yeah, to restrict their rights. Yeah. So for me, the agency actually plays such an important role in ensuring that the rights of the domestic workers are upheld. But unfortunately, there is a lot of discrimination going on. There's a lot of racism also, of course, class bias definitely, and this kind of discrimination you even see in how wages are determined, right? Like Filipino domestic workers get higher wages than Indonesians and Burmese and South Asians and they perpetuate that kind of stereotypes about different nationalities. So yes, we have tried to engage with employment agencies, but it hasn't been easy. Yeah, and I think for home also because many of the domestic workers, they run away to us for help. Yeah, and then the agencies get upset. Yeah, and say, why did you go to home? Why didn't you come to us? Yeah, and I'm like, well, they didn't go to you because you were providing a service to them, yeah, because you were abusing them, right? So you don't help them at all. So I think it is a very difficult challenge, and we've tried to approach agencies at a more collective level, like engaging with the employment of the Association of Employment Agencies. So, I mean, we have been able to, in these meetings, establish some kind of dialogue and some kind of understanding about issues which we find problematic. And I think one of the things which we were able to agree on was that the recruitment fees are too high. Yeah, the Association of Employment Agencies themselves feel that MOM should cap it at a much lower level. Yeah. The Employment Agencies Act actually does cap placement fees, but they are at 2 months maximum. But many agencies are able to go around this legislation by disguising the rest of the debts as loans. Yeah, so it's a private loan. It's not really an agency fee. Yeah, so in our dialogue with the association, they agree that agencies doing this is wrong. Yeah, but they say that it's very difficult for them to control their members. And what MOM should do is to really enforce the legislation and ensure that the domestic worker doesn't pay more than 2 months. Yeah, so I think there is some scope, yeah, and for us to work together, and we have found some space in which we agree with one another. But at this point, we haven't been able to partner with them in a very substantial way in terms of getting policy to change or getting the practices of many of these agencies to change. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have 2 burning questions, one from the front and one from the back. So if you could make a bit of time for them.
Hi, my name is Yun. I'm Singaporean. I'm not from NUS. I'm from Holland Village. I'm a friend of Gilda, and I got to know her by dog walking, my dog. Thank you everyone for providing this event and the documentary. One question is, will you be showing this to the public? Is it going to be on YouTube or Facebook where I can share the link with everyone? Because honestly, most people on the street don't know the basic rights of foreign domestic workers. It's a cultural attitude, I think, because Asians are ingrained with second-class citizens, slaves. You know, we are used to having people, the caste system. And I think this documentary is very important for just showing the uncles and aunties who watch TV on Channel 5, not just on StarHub, but Channel 5, Channel 8, Channel News Asia. You know, this documentary, not just in English, but with maybe Chinese subtitles, Malay, because, you know, you'd be surprised that a lot of HDB residents who employ domestic workers don't speak English. And they expect that all these are, you know, it's the norm, it's normal. You cannot trust the workers. Yeah. And I can see the difference between, say, an expatriate family who employs a foreign domestic worker compared to a Singaporean local family. Doesn't matter whether it's a HDB flat or a condo or a landed property. Okay, thank you.
That's a great point. So we are going to put up our Facebook page of the campaign that has the videos that are also available on YouTube, including the documentary being on YouTube. We have talked about the possibility of getting the documentary through MDA so that it is licensed, so that we have opportunities of actually showing it in spaces. The other point you bring up is a great point, and we really struggled with that, which was whether to have Channel News Asia and you know, sort of the Chinese language media and the Malay language media. And we sort of went with what was the easiest for us in some ways, but I think that certainly is one of the next steps of the project, is to actually translate this and make it be available in the local languages as well. Great, thanks.
I think we have one last question. 2 last questions. I'm very sorry, but I think we have a bit of struggle deciding on who gets to get the mic.
All right, just bear with me for a very quick question.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Andrew. I come from the Nanyang Technological University. formerly a proud graduate from CNM as well. Yes, so the first question I'd like to ask is about the... Alright, one question, right? One question I'm given, okay, no problem. Okay, so the question which I want to ask is about engagement of stakeholders. So far I've been talking about the engagement from the ground up, which is the foreign domestic workers themselves, and also from the policy level, which is the uppermost, if I would say. And also one of the questions raised was that about the employment agencies, the engagement as well. But one very fundamental stakeholder, which I think the foreign domestic worker can relate to most, is that of the employer. So what are the steps in which home can sort of possibly take to engage the employer rather, than just using awareness campaigns? We may create awareness campaigns, but it's almost like watching a movie. We watch a movie, after that we go back, we have some feelings about it, but the next day we wake up, it's back to normal again. And the same thing for policies. And actually, I do find from my own research and academics as well, that policies sometimes do have a intuitive effect, in that because the employers, they are disgruntled because of certain legislations that are passed on, then they pass on that anger and the frustration to the foreign domestic workers itself, so it has a negative effect. So what are the ways in which we can engage the employers to help seek redress for the domestic workers?
With employers, I think they are actually one of the more difficult groups to engage, because employers of domestic workers are usually individuals. They're not like companies. Yeah, so it's more difficult to reach out to them, and whether they want to actually talk to you is another thing altogether. So we do have employers that we talk to, but they tend to be the ones who are supportive, right? The ones who are actually on your side. So the ones that are not on your side, they don't even want to see you. So that has been a struggle for us. With agencies, at least they have an association, right? So it's easy to engage them. But there's no association of domestic worker employers. So there is SNEF, which is the Singapore National Employers Federation, but they're made up of corporations. Yeah, and employers of domestic workers clearly have no interest to join an association like this. So in terms of engagement with employers, yeah, it's tough, because the only thing we can do really is just to target the public at large, because this is where the employers are, and also prospective employers. So until employers get together, I think it might be a bit difficult to engage them as a collective body. We get a lot of accusations from employers that, you always cite the maid, so they always say that to us, right? Then I will tell them, why you go and set up your own group lah. Yeah, you start your own group of employer association, because they say that we always fight for the workers, don't fight for them. I'm like, but we are an NGO for workers, so why would we be fighting for you, right? You have the power to organize yourselves and come together to promote your own interests. So why don't you do that? In fact, when you do that, it's easier for us to engage you. So yeah, I think it's difficult, but employers clearly also, if they want to promote their interests, they need to get their act together. But until that happens, I think the best approach is to engage the public at large. Yeah.
Okay, very aptly, we are ending this session with the last question from the photographer of this poster.
Yeah, I want to ask Professor Mohammed, since they are all my friends there, so I don't need to ask you three there, only Professor Mohammed. Okay, I involved in this project, yeah, the photo session and everything. My last question is, what's next? Yeah. After you go deep into this process, you go deep into the migrants issue, what's next? Because we are here for 10 years, home is already 10 years, and we see how weekly day off, it's a long journey, long fight. 10 years, I think, yeah, Jalaban? Yeah. Then after you go in, then what is next? I know that you involved in so many projects, you go to India or what, but what about this migrant issue? Because I think university have more natural penetration to the community, especially the Singapore now. Migrants is like common enemy in the community. Thanks.
I think, Dominica, thank you for that question, and that's a great point. So just to sort of wrap up, we have already been conversing about starting the next step of the campaign. Again, we will go back to our advisory board and start working on a particular issue. So you saw the documentary highlight a variety of issues. So we will pick up one particular issue, and that will be the issue frame that we will work on the next step of the campaign. It could be something like the contracts and the implementation of the contracts, or it could be the food rights, or it could be having access to the money that you're promised and making sure you're earning that money. So any of these, again, it depends upon what our advisory board comes up with the next, but certainly this is just the beginning of the campaign, the starting point, and we hope to see a lot more out of it coming out. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank our panel for taking the time to join us today, especially Juvi, who has flown in all the way from Philippines last evening to be with us today. We would also like to extend a small token of appreciation for Jolavan, Celine, and Juvi. Could I invite Professor Mohan on stage to hand out the tokens of appreciation? Jolavan. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have found this panel session and screening informative and useful, especially in understanding the context and problems of domestic work in Singapore. I would like to thank each of you for joining us today. To find out more about CARE, our researchers are distributing flyers on the right and left-hand sides of the auditorium, as well as on the reception table. We would also like to invite everyone to like the Facebook page, as well as to have a view of our Respect Our Rights website. Yeah, and the Facebook page as well. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you at our next event.